My journey as a grief worker started with my own experiences with my own grief. So today I'm going to share with you 3 lessons that I have learned from my grief. And trust me, I learned these lessons the hard way. Hello, I am jomcrogers and I am a grief therapist. And today we're going to be exploring around lessons from grief. So if learning and discussing and supporting all things grief is important to you, please be sure to subscribe to the channel. Please join our grievolution community where we can do grief differently. And please turn on the notifications so you will know every time we talk about a different aspect of grief. In retrospect, I have come to realize that in both my personal and professional life, I have always been the champion of the underdog, of the dismissed, of the forgotten, of the overlooked. Perhaps this is why I've chosen grief as my career path, because grief belongs to all of those categories. Today we're going to explore some of those lessons. Many of the grief authors and philosophers and therapists will tell you that there's no wrong way to do grief. But I am going to respectfully disagree with that because I had the experience of doing grief in a very wrong manner. So lesson number 1 for me started with the death of my father. When my dad died suddenly, I was a student social worker doing a placement on an inpatient psychiatric ward. When you entered the unit, there was a chalkboard that had both the patient's name and then the person who was supporting them written beside it. So you knew who your go-to person was for that day, both as staff and as patient. I would spend the walk to work, it was about 20 minutes after my dad died, I would spend the walk to work playing this little mind game with myself, wondering which side of the board my name would be on, because not only was I feeling very unwell, I also had the awareness that I was very unwell. The irony of this is that I spent my days on this unit surrounded by psychiatrists and psychologists and nurses and social workers who were designed to be able to help people who were hurting. But I was so skilled at hiding my grief, not once did anybody ask if I was okay, how was I doing, did I need anything. So what that left me with was a much longer, a much deeper, and a very protracted experience with my grief. And the lesson that I learned, coming from a family that doesn't like to talk, coming from a place where I felt I needed to be who I wasn't a grieving person, I was a social work student doing her placement. The lesson that came from all of that is do not do grief alone. It becomes dangerous. It becomes a dangerous message. Your grief isn't seen, you feel unseen, and it is really a large lesson in staying under the radar in life if you're not careful. So lesson number 1, don't do it alone. Lesson number 2 comes soon after the death of my father. As a student, I then started receiving monthly benefits checks. And as a starving student, I was very happy that there was some financial support coming. It was very necessary to meet all of my bills and my tuition, that this little bonus check would come in the mail. But the tricky part was that check came because my dad died. And that check came with the title Orphan's Benefits on it. That was probably the start of a very weird relationship that I have with money, where it's a necessity, it's a push-pull, but there's a certain repulsion to it at the same time. And it's probably something that I struggle with to this very day, my relationship with money. So I knew then that my grief had changed something for me. The second example that I'm going to offer up in lesson number 2 came with the death of my mother. When my mother died, I, for some reason, felt that I needed new shoes to wear to the funeral. Things that weren't important seem so important. Anyways, I was at the mall shopping for new shoes. And this was a very long time ago again. This was when the O.J. Simpson white Ford Bronco chase on the highway was taking place. And I was in the mall, and apparently there was a lot of electronic stores, it seemed, because every TV screen was tuned in to the white Ford Bronco highway chase. The PA system in the mall was broadcasting from the radio, and all I wanted to do was shout to everybody, "Don't you know my mother just died?" I was so out of step with the world. I felt so unseen. And the combination of feeling so unrecognized and so out of step with the world left me wondering if I was completely losing my mind. Therefore, I should very much keep that to myself and just go about my task of shopping. So the two conclusions that come in this lesson is that grief changes you. Grief changed my relationship with money, and grief changed my relationship with the world for a time being. What I want to say is that these are also hard lessons because grief is bound to change you. And if you do your grief work, then I believe that you will come out with some wisdom of the experiences of your grief, as opposed to just coming out of your grief experiences with the pain. So lesson number 2 is know that grief will change you. Help guide how it will change you. And the third lesson in grief that I have learned the hard way is that grief does not equal grief. My grief is not harder or more desperate or deeper than yours, but my grief is my grief, and your grief is your grief. And when I've had loss happen in my family, if I'm able to detach myself a little bit from the immediate emotions, if I'm able to step back, what's fascinating to me is that though we are mourning the loss of the same person, our experience is completely different. And what comes to our rescue when we're grieving is our childhood blueprints. It is our lived experiences. And for better or for worse, that is what serves us during our grief periods. So this is where things show up, such as how skilled are you at asking for help? How skilled are you at communicating? How skilled are you at receiving? How skilled are you at being an introvert or an extrovert at the funeral? And how does that support you through the day? How have you had experiences with anger or depression or anxiety in the past? And how is that influencing what you're now experiencing in your grief? Who in the family feels that this needs to be an experience with an open casket? And who in the family feels that they can't possibly view an open casket with their loved one? My grief is going to be different than your grief. And what that means is my grief is going to need a different skill set than your grief. But where the common denominators are, that while you may not totally get my grief, there are ways to work so that my grief can be seen and respected and supported. And there are things that I can do to see and respect and support your grief, though our grief may look very different. There needs to be a moment where someone in the room says, "Look, we don't know how to do this." And it's important to note that we are all just doing the best that we can. So lesson 3 has taught me that while nobody will exactly get my grief, I will never exactly get your grief. What we need to work towards is seeing, supporting, accepting one another's grief. That's the important part. That wasn't a perspective that I had when my mother passed, or when my father passed, or when other family members passed early on. These are long ago griefs that I'm discussing, and I've done a ton of work on all of these, and I have been able to kind of wring out the wisdom of the lessons. When I'm talking about lessons of your grief, I'm not suggesting that, oh, these were life lessons that you needed and therefore grief found you. And I am not suggesting the way some really well-intentioned but missing the mark condolence cards suggest that everything happens for a reason, or you'll see the wisdom in this. It's not that. It's, I'm going to quote Winston Churchill and say that never waste a good crisis. So what I have learned is don't do it alone. Grief's going to change you. And know that your grief is your grief, therefore your answer to your grief is yours as well. But we need to see, respect, and support one another's grief. It's so important. Otherwise, grief stays underground, and I would have been caught back in that dangerous place of wondering which side of the board was my name showing up. Was I the helper? Or was I the one who needed help? It's pretty clear I needed help. But that came later because I figured out how to ask. So my lessons in grief have become some of the principles in how I live my life. They have definitely become the principles in how I do my grief. You can have a grief experience and have the wounds from it. Or you can have a grief experience and have the wounds and find your own personal wisdom in what is it that you're going to wring out of that to help you live your life. So I really thank you for your time today. If any of this resonates with you, if any of this is helpful, I would really appreciate you leaving a comment below so that we can again, see one another, support one another, share our wisdom, and learn maybe something about ourselves through your comments. So if you wouldn't mind leaving that below, I think it's going to help our grievolution community know that we are doing grief differently. I thank you for your time, and as always, when approaching your grief work, take self-compassion. So as always, please, kind thoughts, kind words, and a kind heart when you're doing your grief work. Thank you, and take good care.